But for this introduction segment today, I'll be talking to you a little bit more about the idea of recording ritual and routine, and I'll be doing that from a Japanese context. So really just thinking about Japan's history and love of routine and ritual is kind of the place I'm coming from on this one. In Japan, there's a kind of a really deeply held belief and sort of reverence for the idea of ritual as something that has been so long held within tradition. Sometimes you see so many different types of things being described as rituals in Japan, and most of the time these things are really just simple tasks that are kind of, when they're considered, they are just really just simple tasks. But the amount of focus and the amount of kind of dedication that goes into completing these tasks and carrying them out in a very specific way elevates them to these kind of important practices of mindfulness, which in of themselves become these really interesting bits of ritual. So some examples of this. So you've got Ikebana, which is, again, centuries old. It's basically the art of arranging flowers and plants in a specific way. You also have Chado, which is the Japanese ceremonial tea drinking practice, which is actually where the kind of like the whole chai latte comes from. No, not chai, matcha latte, sorry, not chai. That's a different context. Matchas come from, is from this process. And again, this is a very central part of, like, it becomes ritualized in a way because of its importance within Japanese culture. You also have, which kind of doesn't technically count, but you have kintsugi, which is this art of repairing broken pottery by gluing it together as if it was kind of new, but then using the glue, it's got gold in it, so it kind of highlights these elements and these imperfections that had to be kind of made in order to make these pieces whole again. So there's a kind of appreciation of that. And then there's also one of the oldest rituals is called shodo, which is, by the way, I'm butchering all these Japanese terms, so I'm not coming from any sense of authority on this. But anyway, yeah, which is kind of it's essentially Japanese calligraphy, but it requires an intense amount of awareness, mindfulness, and focus, which again, in of itself, becomes this kind of elevated into this ritual in a sense because of the amount of focus and presence that's just needed to make it happen. So and obviously, last but not least, this one I think applies to you all, perhaps the most directly and the most kind of obviously. So you have Oporo, which is the daily routine of kind of bathing or soaking in a steaming hot bath at the end of a very long day. This process goes back a very long time, and I think it's seeded in the culture of Japan with this kind of onsen culture, which is the reliance or the kind of having access to so many hot water springs has become part of Japanese culture. And I think this is a little takeaway from that. And, it goes back really far in Japanese history. And you can see, back then that just involved literally just firing up some wood and just sitting under the water until it gets very hot. So, I think this, again, like I said, this could more directly apply to your own sensibilities about routine. But I mean, in each of these examples, the main thing I want to highlight is the fact that there's what elevates each of these tasks into a ritual is being completely present and aware and in the moment and kind of focusing on the task, which again takes them beyond these kind of things that you have to do into things that become genuine acts of connections and ritual. And there's elements of Zen Buddhism that kind of come into this, but I won't get into that today. But I think the thing that I would like you to think about is like, well, how do these things, how does this level of attention and focus affect your own routines? And do you pay do through the act of carrying out a routine, are you actually paying attention, or is it really like your connection to routine is about just like switching off while this happens because you've done it so many times that it's an automatic process? And then moving on, I think the question I want to also ask is like, so what happens if you apply this level of intense focus and awareness on observing routines and rituals? So what happens if you kind of focus this lens in on the idea of like documenting the everyday? So this takes me on to talking about Wajiro Kon. Again, probably not how you pronounce his name, sorry. So he was a Japanese architect who founded an entire branch of sociology and observation, which he named Modernology. I could say it before, I don't know why I can't say it now. It's Modernology, that's it. So the idea basically behind Modernology was really to just practice the act of documenting processes of social, economic, and cultural change in Japan specifically that were taking place at the turn of the 20th century. And really, this is kind of his attempt to try and understand what's happening to Japanese culture as it kind of becomes a little bit more westernized, as things change a lot at the kind of, like I said, at the beginning of the 20th century in Tokyo specifically, and as it undergoes the process of becoming a metropolitan city. All of this was really triggered by this response to the urgent need for housing after the 1923 Great Kanto earthquake in Japan, where he had tried to provide, as an architect, provide as much immediate housing for people who were suffering from the earthquakes. And through the process of designing and providing these places, he also then carried out a study of all these of all the people's lifestyles and their kind of belongings that they managed to keep with them, and how those belongings fitted into these new homes that he kind of designed. And so, continuing after the earthquake, he really took on this process of documenting the changes through really just building an immensely detailed and really thorough set of sketches and drawings. As you can see here is just like a section view of someone's house. Really like did not leave any kind of, every object takes up a space, and you can start to see him developing this system of kind of like annotating and starting to add lines and things to these things. But this attention really just went beyond space. He paid attention to the most minuscule things, the most mundane things, like cracked and aged bowls, in documenting them from different angles, different states of disrepair, different states of love, if you want to call it that. Looking at patterns of movements in a house, and I think some of you will remember this is similar to the plan that I showed you last week that Jane Drew did of a kind of like patterns of movements and mapping efficiency in kind of a Western like kitchen context and a domestic context. It's a similar approach here, but you can just start to see how he's then starting to develop this really like interesting way of labeling and adding so much information to a very kind of like detailed drawing already. He documented entire wardrobes, people's different clothing, how all the different types of clothing, whether it's just all the different hats, all the different gloves, all the different robes, all the different socks, belts, towels, envelopes, cigarettes, all this kind of like really small stuff. He didn't leave any stone unturned, and it was just kind of like this pure obsession. Obsession maybe it's not a great word, but pure focus on really documenting everything. He documented people walking through public space and how they kind of interacted with each other. Did they walk together? Did they walk separately? Did they meet? Did they not meet? Really interesting thinking about that. And then he also did a study where he looks at how people in space were dressing, and again, this goes back to the idea that he was trying to track the processes of social and cultural change in Japan, and specifically in Tokyo as it becomes this metropolitan city. You can start to see him making this direct comparison between the number of people who were wearing more traditional Japanese attire and clothing versus the kind of slightly more new Western style of clothing. It's a very kind of like roaring 20s aesthetic that you can start to see come through here, and yeah, that pervaded across the whole world, and it's kind of the first example of some of these kind of global trends. And he also then did other things too, specifically focusing on more physical things. He looked at cracked windows, broken windows, just documented again states of disrepair. He also sketched out people who were sleeping, I think, on the streets. I think these are rough sleepers. Don't take me with a good authority on that. I can't speak Japanese, so I can't completely understand everything in the drawings. But it's really interesting to see how there's different scales to his levels of observation that goes from bowls to people to buildings, and this process of documenting and detailing the minutiae of the everyday was kind of in its own right. Like I said, it's almost become a ritual in its own sense, and a routine for him. His practice became this process of documenting other rituals, which I would also say is a ritual in of itself. But he really was looking at these kind of relationships of people to objects and to each other and to their buildings. And through trying to map these processes of change, I think he developed some kind of like interesting set of kind of documentations of culture at a very specific moment and is something that I think is really, really fascinating. And actually is something that's quite consequential. So others built on Wajiro's studies and expanded this whole branch of sociology and observation that he started over the course of the 20th century. Although it remained within mostly a Japanese context, Kohn really had an influence, especially when you think about architecture. So he really focused on the idea that designers should really think about architecture with culture in mind, thinking about how can culture be influence the use of space. And I think by developing these studies in the 1920s and 30s specifically, that's when he was most active, he kind of built this idea of geographic rationalism into his housing and community facilities project that he did end up building as an architect too. So I think it's really interesting to see how you can, your practices and your interests of things can feed into your own practices in very unique and interesting ways. And that's something I really would like you all to kind of like try to push. And you can really trace the impact of this branch of sociology in Atelier Bauau's behaviorology philosophy. Now, I don't know how many of you know Atelier Bauau, but they are a Japanese architecture practice that are kind of really well known. They have these amazing drawings. I don't have any examples in this lecture, but I would recommend you have a look at them. They're very they almost have a very similar sense of detail and sort of simple aesthetic, but really complex layers of information in them. And they kind of, when I looked at them, and I looked at Wajiro Kohn's drawings, I kind of see the influence almost as well. And there is an acknowledgement of that in this book, so in Behaviorology. And really, the term behaviorology isn't actually exclusively like relating to Atelier Bauau, but Atelier Bauau reappropriated this term from the scientific study of behavior, and I don't know the exact terms for it, but in this book, they kind of outlined their philosophy for behaviorology, and they talk about the idea of behaviorology as this thing, or as these people, behaviorologists, as you can see in the quote there, they discover these kind of like rules and regulations that help people kind of govern how they behave in space, but then also start to think a little bit more about how they can manipulate or even use these rules to be able to make their designs more effective or more kind of like responsive to people's everyday lives, and to also improve their everyday lives as well. And this is the cover of the book, and so in the cover of the book they do actually describe this, but I think this is a very clunky and clumsy wording for that. But just to kind of take this a little bit further, this diagram I think is one of the better ways to think about how behaviorology situates itself within these kind of theories of space. Now, this is something I don't think we need to go into right now, but if anyone's interested, I think just reading anything by Henri Lefebvre, mostly specifically thinking about spatial production is a really good place to start. It starts to question the idea of like how space and specifically architecture can relate to the idea of form, function, use, and how behavior can mediate between those two. So I'm going to leave it with that, because I think this is like staring at the edge of a cliff. I think going any further, we'll have to really get into some theories that I don't think we need to get to this week. But really the purpose of today's introduction was to get you thinking about ways in which you can capture and reflect on routines and rituals. So just to think a little bit more about how that process of documenting can dovetail into your own design process. So again, this is moving on to next week's, or hinting at some of the things that we'll be looking at next week, but really just thinking in kind of further and more critically about how you kind of carry out routines and why you carry out routines, and what actually is the distinction consciously and subconsciously between routine and ritual for you and for others around you. As I said, I'll be looking forward to hearing some of your experiences in the training routines exercise for those of you who've done it. And I think it'd be interesting to see also some of your thoughts on this process of documenting. But first, obviously got to give you today's questions. So for this day, we'll be talking about, the first question is it possible to understand much from meticulously drawing and documenting the everyday? So in kind of Wajiro Kohn's fashion, does the act of almost obsessively, like really drawing everything and detailing it, annotating it, and building this kind of idea around it, does that actually help you understand much in terms of routine or ritual? Or does it help you understand the current situation? Does it help you just understand the object as it is? Second question is, how different is a routine or a ritual to you if you're aware that you are doing it? And this kind of goes back into some of the early examples I gave of rituals in Japan, is that what elevates something into a ritual is the kind of the sheer presence and the awareness that you are doing this, and focusing your entire being and kind of concentrating on that as a concept. So when you're doing a routine, does making a cup of coffee, is that a routine? Are you focused on the act of making a cup of coffee if you've made a cup of coffee for the last 5 years at the same time in the same way? Or is it an opportunity for you to kind of like think a little bit more deeply about that? And last but not least, if ritual is a personal and reflective practice, how can you capture and document its effect on someone? So if the idea of ritual being this kind of highly subjective and personal thing that you do, you can take pictures of someone doing it, but how do you capture the side of that is internal? How do you capture the internalized aspects of like thinking about how they feel, or how that changes how they feel, or how they can, you know, how does it look like when someone is centered? As some of the earlier conversations, we talked about routines and rituals. We talked about how routines help you feel centered. But what does that mean, and how does that look as well? So these are some of the questions I have for you today. Hopefully, you know, it'll be interesting to see what you all think and kind of how you reflect on all these questions I posed for you today. So I will see you around, and hopefully, see you around, and hopefully you'll have some really interesting conversations as well. All right, thanks.